Picture the most beautiful coastline in Australia, turquoise water against red Pindan cliffs, 22 kilometres of white sand, camels walking in silhouette along Cable Beach as the sun drops into the Indian Ocean. This is Broome, and it is genuinely one of the loveliest places on the earth. Now here is the part nobody tells you. A century ago, this remote town at the far edge of the continent supplied roughly 80% of the entire world's pearl shell. Not pearls. Shell. The mother of pearl that became the buttons on the world's shirts. And every gram of it was pulled off the seafloor by divers, more than 1 in 10 of whom died every single year. 4 times this town found something to save it, and 4 times that same thing nearly wiped it off the map. This is the story of why nobody wants to visit Broome anymore. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. 4/5 of the world. The town sits on Yawuru country, on the shore of Roebuck Bay, named for the ship of the English buccaneer William Dampier, who landed here in 1699. But the town itself did not exist until much later. It was gazetted in November 1883 and named after the Governor of Western Australia, Sir Frederick Napier Broome. And here is the first small irony in a story absolutely full of them. Governor Broome reportedly took one look at the miserable little settlement that was to carry his name, a place he is said to have described as 3 graves and a few itinerants, and was horrified. It is worth pausing on how improbable this place was. Broome sits in the Kimberley, the far tropical northwest of Western Australia, one of the most remote and ancient landscapes on the planet, 1,000 kilometres from the nearest city of any size and cut off from the rest of the country by desert and sheer distance. The Yawuru people had lived on this coast for tens of thousands of years, gathering and trading pearl shell long before any European arrived, wearing carved shell ornaments called ridgi. When the Europeans finally came, they came not for the land, which was hard and dry and offered almost nothing, but for what lay in the water just offshore. Everything about Broome, its wealth, its people and its tragedies, came out of the sea. It was never a farming town or a mining town in the ordinary sense. It was a town that existed to reach down into the ocean and pull something valuable out of it, and to keep doing that no matter the cost. Let me clear up 2 things straight away, because almost everyone gets them wrong. And the truth is the whole point of this story. The first is Cable Beach. That gorgeous stretch of sand is not named for anything scenic. It is named for a telegraph cable, an undersea line laid in 1889 that came ashore right there, connecting Australia to Java and on to the rest of the world. The beach is named after a wire. The second correction is the big one. Broome is famous as a pearling town, and everyone assumes that means pearls. It does not. The fortune that built Broome came from the shell, the mother-of-pearl lining of a giant oyster called Pinctada maxima, the largest pearl oyster in the world. That iridescent shell was cut and worked into buttons, buckles, cutlery handles and inlay, and shipped to the great cities of Europe and America. An actual gem pearl, when a diver found one, was a rare bonus, locked away in a box on the boat. Broome did not get rich on jewellery. Broome got rich on buttons. Hold that image, the humble mother-of-pearl button gleaming on a gentleman's shirt front, because that button is the key to everything that follows. Every one of them had to be pulled up off the seafloor by hand, and the way this town did that is the darkest part of the whole story. Chapter 2. The divers come from everywhere. The problem with Broome's shell was where it lay. The richest beds were in deep water, 20 to 25 fathoms down, which is 45 metres, far deeper than the shallow beds of the Torres Strait or the older grounds further south. To reach it, a diver was sealed into a heavy canvas suit, a copper helmet bolted over his head, and lead weights hung off his chest and boots, and then lowered into the murky, shark-thick water, where he would walk the seafloor almost horizontal against the current, filling a bag with shell. He might make 50 descents in a single day. The lugger stayed out at sea for months at a time. There was, in these early years, no understanding whatsoever of what the deep water did to the human body. A diver who came up too fast from those depths would be struck down by an affliction the men called diver's paralysis, a crippling and often deadly agony we now know as decompression sickness, the bends, caused by nitrogen bubbling out of the blood. Royal Navy diving tables that could have prevented much of it were only introduced to the industry around 1912, and even then they were routinely ignored, for a simple and brutal reason. The divers were paid according to how much shell they brought up. To dive slowly and safely was to earn less, to dive fast and deep was to earn more, and to gamble your life on every single ascent. The system did not merely tolerate the danger, it quietly rewarded it. It was skilled, lethal work, and the men who did it came from all over the maritime world. There were Malays, Coepangas from Timor, Filipinos, the locals called Manalaman, the Chinese, and above all, Japanese, who became the elite divers, most of them from the town of Taiji and the villages of Wakayama Prefecture in Japan. Broome became, by a distance, the most cosmopolitan town in Australia, a place where a dozen languages met on the foreshore. And here is where the story sharpens, because that multicultural workforce existed in open defiance of the entire logic of the country around it. This was the era of the White Australia policy, the raft of law from 1901, designed explicitly to keep the country white and to keep Asian workers out. But the pearling masters argued successfully that no white man would or could do the diving, and so Broome was granted an extraordinary thing, an exemption. The one industry in the entire nation legally permitted to bring in the very Asian labour the rest of the country was built to exclude. Under the law, only a British subject could own a lugger. But the men who went down into the water to dive for the shell were overwhelmingly not white. Remember that exemption, because it is the engine of everything Broome would become, and everything it would be accused of. But before the Japanese divers and their canvas suits ever arrived, the first people sent down into that water were Aboriginal, and a great many of them did not go by choice. Chapter 3. Blackbird Ed. Before the hard hat diving suit arrived in the 1880s, the shell was collected by what the industry coldly called skin divers, people who went down into the water on a single held breath again and again until their lungs and ears gave out. And in the earliest, ugliest years of the trade, those divers were Aboriginal people, taken from communities all along the coast, and enormous numbers of them were forced into it against their will. The practice had a name: blackbirding. It was, in plain terms, slavery. Aboriginal people were rounded up along the Kimberley coast, sometimes lured, very often simply taken against their will, and put to work diving for shell. There is a detail here that tells you everything about the mindset of the time. Aboriginal women in particular were sought after as divers, on a belief, entirely false, that they could stay under the water longer, and a great many of them never came back from it. We do not have to imagine this, because Aboriginal people who lived it passed the memory down. A Yawarru woman named Mary Teresa Torres Barker spoke only a few years ago about her own grandmother, Polly Drummond, who had been one of those early divers. In the early days, she said, there was no one else to do the job, and they found the women had the lung capacity to stay underwater longer. They were the best. It is a single sentence that carries an entire hidden history inside it of Aboriginal skill and Aboriginal suffering both, spoken plainly by a descendant of the people who were sent down into that water first. This is not rumour, it is in the government's own records. As early as 1886, the government resident at Roebuck Bay, a man named Colonel Angelo, reported to his superiors that white men in the district were, in his account, openly advertising that they were procuring men, and he quoted a price. £5 a head. There were laws passed in 1871 and again in 1873 that nominally banned the use of Aboriginal women as divers, and they were widely ignored. Today, on the Broome foreshore, there is a bronze statue called the Women of Pearling. It is there because this happened, and because for a long time nobody wanted to talk about it. And here is the fact that should sit heaviest of all. Despite a royal commission, despite the reports, despite everyone knowing, no pearlining master was ever successfully prosecuted for any of it. The trade was simply too valuable. The luggers needed divers. The divers were cheap or wholly unpaid, and a single bag of shell was worth more to the colony of the day than the life of the person who had brought it up from the bottom. That cold calculation, far more than any one cruel individual, is the real villain of these early years, and it is a calculation that would define the town again and again. And as the shell money poured in, the town it built became the richest, strangest and most dangerous place in Australia. Chapter 4. The richest, deadliest town in Australia. By the years just before the First World War, Broome had reached a peak that is genuinely hard to believe for a town at the end of the earth. In 1913, its pearling fleet numbered 403 luggers. Around 3,500 people worked in the industry. And this one remote Australian town was supplying, at its height, roughly 80% of all the pearl shell on the planet. At the top of the market, that shell was worth around £400 a tonne. The world's shirt buttons, 4/5 of them, came from the waters off this single stretch of red Kimberley coast. The town that money built was like nowhere else in the country. Its Chinatown, the beating commercial heart, filled up when the luggers came in for the lay-up season, and hundreds of crews came ashore at once with months of pay in their pockets. There were Asian stores and boarding houses, gambling dens running through the night, and an open-air picture garden, Sun Pictures, that still runs today. For a few short years, Broome was rich, wild, and utterly unique. Money flowed through the town in a way that seems impossible now. The master pearlers, the men who owned the fleets and the licenses, built themselves grand bungalows with wide verandas and corrugated iron roofs, and imported their luxuries from Singapore and Japan. The greatest of the pearling houses, a firm called Streeter and Mail, dominated the whole trade, owned cattle stations inland, built its own luggers, and gave its name to the jetty where the shell came ashore. The man who ran it, Arthur Mail, was described by the Australian Dictionary of Biography, in its own words, as a harsh employer, and he sat for years as the local Member of Parliament. This was a company town in all but name, a place where a handful of British subject pearling masters at the top grew rich on the labour and the lives of the hundreds of Asian and Aboriginal divers at the bottom, who were the ones actually going into the water to die. But now we have to talk about the cost, because it is the true heart of this story, and it is staggering. The diving killed men at a rate that is difficult to comprehend. The National Museum of Australia states plainly that it is likely more than 1 in 10 of the Japanese divers died every single year, every year. And across the whole period, before the First World War, up to a third of all the indentured divers who came to Broome lost their lives. They died of drowning, of cyclones, and above all, of the killer they called divers' paralysis, the agony we now know as the bends, caused by surfacing too fast from the deep. On the edge of town lies the Japanese cemetery, the largest in Australia, where 919 people rest beneath headstones made of coloured beach stones, many of them turned to face home, across the sea, toward Japan. Most of the men buried there died in their 20s. The sea killed them one at a time, quietly with the bends. But 4 times it came for them by the 100, all at once. Chapter 5. The Cyclones. The same tropical waters that made Broome rich sat directly in the path of some of the most violent storms on Earth, and every so often a cyclone would sweep across the purling grounds while the fleet was at sea, and the results were apocalyptic. The blows came again and again across the decades, and each one carved a wound into the town. In 1887, a cyclone struck the fleet working the beaches to the south and killed around 140 men. In 1908, another storm sank dozens of luggers and drowned around 40 more, and the survivors clubbed together to raise a stone obelisk in the Japanese cemetery that still stands over the dead. In November 1910, the most destructive cyclone in the town's history hit Broome directly, with winds estimated at 175 kilometres an hour, killing 40 people and wrecking boats and houses across the settlement. And, in 1935, one final catastrophic storm caught the fleet at the Lacepeed Islands and killed around 140 men in a single stroke. These were not distant statistics to the people of Broome. A cyclone in the purling season meant that the fathers and sons and husbands of an entire town might simply not come home. All at once, their boats gone to the bottom with every soul aboard. The 1908 storm alone sank more than 40 luggers. The great blows of 1887, 1910 and 1935 between them account for hundreds of dead, and the true totals will never be known, because the crews were Asian and Aboriginal men whose lives the record keepers of the day did not always trouble to count. Whole fleets vanished in an afternoon. The cemetery on the edge of town grew in sudden, sickening lurches, a year of ordinary drownings and diving deaths, and then, all at once, a great crop of fresh stones from a single storm. The stone obelisk raised after the 1908 cyclone still stands at the centre of the Japanese graves today, paid for by the men who had lived through that one, in memory of all the men who had not. The sea was both the employer and the executioner. And in Broome, the line between the two was only ever a change in the weather. Think about that pattern for a moment, because it is the shape of this entire story. The sea was the source of everything. The shell, the wealth, the whole reason the town existed. And the very same sea was forever trying to destroy it, swallowing the fleet and the men whole, decade after decade. This is the thing you have to understand about Broome. Every single force that ever saved this town was also a force that could destroy it. The sea gave, and the sea took, and the town simply buried its dead and sent the boats out again the next morning. But the sea was not the only thing that could turn on Broome, because far away, on the other side of the world, the market for shell itself was about to collapse, and the town would get its first brutal lesson in the danger of depending on a single thing. Chapter 6. One product, one town. For all its wealth, Broome had a fatal weakness built into its very foundation, and it is the same weakness that has doomed single industry towns the world over. It made one thing. It sold one thing. And a town that lives and dies on one product is only ever one shock away from ruin. That shock came with the First World War. When war broke out in 1914, the shipping lanes seized up and the European button factories that bought Broome shell suddenly stopped buying. Almost overnight, the bottom fell out of the market. By the end of 1914, there was something like 1,500 tonnes of unsold pearl shell simply sitting in the sheds along the Broome foreshore, worth a fortune on paper and nothing at all in reality, because there was no one to sell it to. Pearling had by then grown into the 4th largest export industry in all of Western Australia, behind only gold, timber and wool. And yet, here it was, brought to its knees not by a storm or a diving accident, but by a war 10,000 miles away that had nothing to do with shell at all. This is the danger that haunts every single industry town. And it is worth stating plainly because it is the deep lesson buried inside Broome's whole story. When a place makes only one thing, its fate is tied entirely to the fortunes of that one thing, over which it usually has no control at all. The button makers of Europe did not know and did not care about the divers dying off the Kimberley coast. They cared about the price and the supply, and when the war disrupted both, they simply stopped buying. And a town at the far end of the earth was plunged into crisis by decisions made in boardrooms it would never see. Broome had no second industry to fall back on and no other reason to exist. There was no real farming in that hard country, no other mine, no manufacturing. There was the shell, and only the shell. A more diversified town might have weathered the loss of a single market. Broome could only hold its breath and wait, and pray the buyers would come back. The town survived it, as it always did. The market slowly came back after the war, though the industry never quite recovered its earlier swagger. The fleet began slowly to thin. Japanese competition grew. The terrible cyclone of 1935 tore another hole in the fleet. Broome staggered on through the 1920s and 1930s, a little smaller and a little more fragile each year, still utterly dependent on that one iridescent product from the sea. Each passing year left the town a little more brittle and a little more exposed, a single fragile thread now connecting an entire remote community to the whims of a luxury market on the far side of the planet. And then, on a clear, bright morning in March 1942, the war that had once emptied Broome's sheds came back. Only this time, it did not come for the market. It came for the town itself, and it came out of the sky. Chapter 7. 0 Hour. By early 1942, the Second World War had crashed down into the Pacific, and the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, were falling to the Japanese advance. Broome, remote and forgotten for so long, suddenly found itself a vital staging post. It became a refuelling stop for a desperate air evacuation, as aircraft and great flying boats crammed with refugees fleeing Java came down in Roebuck Bay to take on fuel before the long flight south. On some days, dozens of aircraft passed through. On the morning of the 3rd of March, the bay was crowded with them, many still full of exhausted Dutch civilians who had spent the night aboard. At around 9:30 that morning, 9 Japanese Zero fighter planes came in low out of the north from a base on Timor. There were no defending aircraft in the sky above Broome, and for the next 20 minutes or so, the Zeros had the town and the bay entirely to themselves. It was a massacre. They strafed the flying boats as they sat helpless on the water, and the aircraft caught fire and burned and sank with people still trapped inside them. Burning aviation fuel spread in sheets across the surface of Roebuck Bay. By the time the Zeros turned for home, around 22 to 24 aircraft had been destroyed, 15 of them flying boats on the water. The official death toll was at least 88 people, and it may well have been higher, because no one ever had a complete list of the refugees on board. It was the deadliest air attack on Australian soil after the bombing of Darwin 2 weeks earlier. In the middle of the horror, there was extraordinary courage. An Aboriginal man named Charlie D'Antoine, who worked refuelling the flying boats, repeatedly swam out through the burning fuel to drag survivors from the water. He saved lives at appalling risk to his own. Years later, he said the thing he had been most afraid of that day was not the Japanese bullets coming from above, it was the sharks below. The full scale of the loss took a long time to become clear, and in some ways never entirely did. Many of the dead were Dutch civilians whose names were never properly recorded, refugees who had survived the fall of Java only to die on the water within sight of an Australian beach they had believed meant safety. Whole families were lost inside the flying boats as they sank into the bay. For a town that had already buried so many of its own beneath the sea, the raid was a fresh horror of a wholly different kind, war itself arriving out of a clear blue morning and turning the beautiful bay into a sheet of fire. And there is one last strange thread to the raid. As the Zeros flew home, they shot down a Dutch airliner fleeing Java, which crash-landed on a beach to the north. It was secretly carrying a fortune in diamonds. What happened to those diamonds, most of which were never recovered, remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Australian War. But the bombs and the fire were not the worst thing the war did to Broome, because the war was about to take away the very men who were the pearling industry itself. Chapter 8. The Divers Who Never Came Back. When Japan entered the war at the end of 1941, the Japanese divers of Broome, the most skilled and essential workers in the entire industry, the men who had made the town what it was, ceased overnight to be neighbours and colleagues. In the eyes of the law, they became enemy aliens, and so they were rounded up and interned. Across Australia, more than 1,100 people of Japanese descent were taken into internment camps, and that number included almost the whole of Broome's Japanese community. The men were shipped away to camps like Hay and Loveday, far to the south. Families were sent to a camp called Tatura in Victoria. Among them was a remarkable man named Yasukichi Murakami, who had lived in Broome for decades. A trader, a photographer who documented the whole life of the town, and an inventor who had actually patented an improved diving suit. He was interned with the rest, and he died behind the wire at Tatura in 1944, far from the town that had been his home. When the war finally ended, most of the interned Japanese were not released back to Broome. They were deported to Japan. A community of around 300 people before the war was reduced to about 9. The divers, the men who held the entire irreplaceable skill of the industry in their hands and their lungs, were simply gone, and they did not come back. The fleet, which had once numbered over 400 luggers, had collapsed to around 50. There is a bitter symmetry in it that is hard to miss. For 60 years, Broome had been the one corner of white Australia where Japanese men were not merely tolerated, but actively relied upon, welcome for a skill no one else possessed, and buried in their hundreds in a cemetery the town carefully maintained. They had married into local families. They had built businesses and lives. And then, in the space of a few weeks, the same nation that had granted them their exemption declared them the enemy, took them away, and after the war shipped them back across the sea to a country many of their own children had never seen. The strange loophole in the White Australia policy that had made the town possible in the first place closed with the war, and it took the heart of the industry with it. The divers were not a resource that could be ordered in again like timber or steel. They were the accumulated skill of 2 generations, and when they were gone, that knowledge was simply gone with them. The town might, in time, have rebuilt the fleet and trained new divers, as hard and slow as that would have been. But it never got the chance, because at that exact moment on the other side of the world, a small and utterly unremarkable object was about to make the entire pearl shell trade completely worthless. Chapter 9. The button that sank a town. For 100 years, the mother-of-pearl button had been a small luxury, and Broome had been its greatest source. And then, in the years after the Second World War, the button changed. Through the 1950s, cheap plastic came of age and factories began stamping out moulded plastic buttons by the million. They were lighter, they were tougher, they never cracked, and above all, they were far, far cheaper than a button cut and polished from a shell that a man had risked his life to collect. And so, quietly and completely, the world stopped needing Broome. By around 1960, the global market for pearl shell had collapsed. It was gone. Stop and take in the full irony of that, because it is almost too perfect. The town that had lost 1,000 men to the sea, that had been battered by cyclones and bombed from the air, that had built a global empire on a beautiful object from the deep, was finally brought down not by any of that, but by a cheap plastic button. The humblest, most trivial object imaginable, made in a factory a hemisphere away, made the whole bloody, magnificent, deadly enterprise pointless. The sheds full of shell were now sheds full of nothing. It is worth dwelling on how total this collapse was, because it was not a slow decline so much as an execution. Pearl shell had been a serious global commodity, and the button had been its single largest use by far. When plastic took the button, it did not take a slice of the market. It took very nearly all of it. There was, quite suddenly, almost no reason left for anyone on Earth to pay a premium for a fragile natural shell that had to be dived for at the cost of human lives, when a machine could stamp out a tougher product for a fraction of the price. The great pearling ports of the world went dark more or less together, and Broome, the greatest of them all, went darkest of all. And this is where Broome, true to the pattern of its entire existence, reinvented itself yet again. If the world no longer wanted the shell, then Broome would sell the one thing the shell had always been famous for, but had rarely actually produced: the pearl itself. In 1956, at a remote inlet up the coast called Roebuck Bay, Australia's first cultured pearl farm opened, a joint venture using Japanese techniques to grow pearls deliberately inside the oyster rather than praying to find one by chance. A Greek-Australian pearler named Pasapoli built this new industry into a global powerhouse. And today, Broome grows some of the finest South Sea pearls on Earth. But notice what had happened. The cultured pearl saved the pearl. It did not save the town. It is a quiet, high-tech business of a few offshore farms. It does not need a fleet of 400 luggers or a workforce of thousands. The pearling capital of the world was gone for good. And so Broome did the only thing it had ever known how to do. It looked for one more thing to save it, and this time it decided to sell the view. Chapter 10. The Last Reinvention. The man who reinvented Broome one final time was not a pearler or a local or even an Australian. He was a flamboyant British aristocrat named Lord Alistair MacAlpine, a businessman and former treasurer of Britain's Conservative Party, who wandered into Broome around 1979 and fell completely in love with the place. He began buying up and restoring the crumbling old pearling buildings, saved the Sun Pictures Cinema, and then in 1988 he opened the Cable Beach Club Resort, a luxury resort that put Broome on the map as a glamorous, exotic holiday destination. Local legend says he sealed the land deal on the back of a beer coaster in the Roebuck Bay Hotel. He imported exotic animals, championed the pearls and the Aboriginal art, and dragged Broome into its newest identity, a tourist paradise at the end of the road. It is the same role an outside saviour has played in 100 faded towns. He arrived, he spent, and he made the place believe in itself again. And for a while, it worked beautifully. The camels on Cable Beach at sunset, the staircase to the moon over the mudflats of Roebuck Bay, the pearl showrooms, the Shinju Matsuri Festival, born, fittingly, out of an earlier economic downturn. Broome reinvented itself as one of Australia's great bucket list destinations. And let me be completely clear and fair here, because this matters. Broome today is not a ghost town. Cable Beach is still genuinely one of the most beautiful places in the country. The cultured pearl industry is alive and world-class. In 2006, the Yawuru people won native title over their country, a profound act of justice. The town is loved. But the pattern of Broome's whole existence has not stopped, and the latest thing that saved it is now, in the oldest Broome tradition, beginning to turn on it. Because tourism depends utterly on the very things that have always been Broome's curse. Remoteness and isolation. The town is over 2,200 kilometres from Perth, and the airfares have become so punishing that the state government has had to subsidise thousands of discount seats just to keep visitors coming. In 2025, Broome lost its only international airlink when the Singapore flights were axed. For nearly half the year, from November to April, the brutal wet season and its cyclones shut much of the tourist economy down entirely. And the numbers have started to slide, from around 325,000 overnight visitors in 2022 down to 238,000 in 2024, with visitor spending falling by more than a quarter in a single year. Walk the town today and the fleet of 400 luggers is a memory. Streeter's Jetty, where they once unloaded the shell that clothed the world, is a weathered timber relic, half drowned at high tide. Out in Roebuck Bay, at the lowest tides, the skeletons of the flying boats still surface from the mud, exactly where they burned in 1942. But here is the thing that truly survived, the one rescue that never turned into a curse. It was not the shell, or the pearl, or the resort. It was the people, the extraordinary community that the pearling trade accidentally created. Japanese and Chinese and Malay and Filipino and Aboriginal, all mixed together over a century into something found nowhere else in Australia, gave the country the musical brand new dye, and a culture entirely its own. They are still here. The luggers are gone, but the people the luggers brought together remain. And in a glass case in the Broome Museum sits a single mother-of-pearl button, smooth and iridescent and utterly ordinary. The kind of thing you would sew onto a shirt without a thought. It is the humblest object in the world. And 4/5 of the planet once wore it without ever knowing that. In the deep water off a red beach at the end of Australia, more than 1 in 10 young men died every single year to bring it up into the light.